The stars had been at war for 11 years. Humanity knew this not because anyone had told them, but because they had been listening. For decades, Earth's deep space monitoring arrays, originally built to search for signs of life, had instead become the most sophisticated eavesdropping network in the solar system. Hidden beneath the cover of radio telescope research programs and atmospheric observation satellites, teams of linguists, military analysts, and astrophysicists worked in sealed underground facilities, piecing together the shape of a war being fought billions of kilometers away. They called it Project Stillwater, appropriate because stillness was humanity's only strategy. Dr. Mara Chen, the project's lead analyst, stood before a holographic star map in a bunker beneath the Nevada desert and traced the front lines of a conflict she had spent 9 years studying. The Galactic Conclave, a coalition of 14 spacefaring civilizations, was losing, not catastrophically, not yet, but the trend lines were unmistakable. Every quarter, the Volcae pushed further. Every quarter, conclave worlds fell silent. The Volcae were not evil in any way humans could romanticize. They had no hatred, no ideology, no desire for domination in any emotional sense. They were a hive species, billions of individual biological units operating under a single distributed intelligence, and they expanded for the same reason a fire expands, because there was fuel ahead and nothing strong enough to stop them. They consumed worlds methodically. Stripped atmospheres, harvested mineral cores, processed surviving populations into labor units. It was industrial. It was efficient. It was utterly without malice, which somehow made it worse. Earth had been discovered by the Conclave 22 years ago. A Thalandry survey vessel had stumbled into the solar system, scanned the third planet, and filed a report classifying humanity as a Class 3 primitive world. Pre-FTL civilization, capable of basic nuclear reaction. No significant military capacity. Recommendation: leave undisturbed, revisit in 50 years. The Conclave had followed that recommendation without a second thought. What the survey vessel had failed to notice, because it hadn't looked closely enough, was that the Class 3 primitive world had detected the survey vessel the moment it crossed Neptune's orbit, tracked it for the entire duration of its stay, and recorded every frequency it transmitted on. Humanity had said nothing, done nothing, filed their own report in a bunker that didn't officially exist and gone back to listening. Secretary General Amara Osaibansu had inherited Project Stillwater along with the job. She was a compact Ghanaian woman in her late 50s with a background in international law and a reputation for the kind of calm that made people in crisis feel, irrationally, that everything might be fine. She reviewed Mara's latest briefing in silence, turning the pages slowly, her expression unreadable. "They don't know we've been watching," Mara said. It wasn't a question. "No," Amara said. "And that is the only advantage we have, so we are going to be very careful about spending it." Below them, in the deeper levels of the facility, engineers were running stress tests on weapons systems that had never been publicly announced. Physicists were refining drive technologies assembled from debris fields that Earth's unmanned probes had quietly visited in the aftermath of distant battles. Biologists were studying Volcae biology from recovered tissue samples, looking for weaknesses in a species that had never lost a war. The world above them argued about climate policy and election cycles and trade agreements. It was not ignorance most world leaders knew about Stillwater. It was a choice. Normalcy was a mask, and humanity wore it well. That evening, Mara stood outside the bunker entrance and looked up at a sky that looked perfectly peaceful. Somewhere up there, the conclave was burning. She went back inside. There was more to learn. The fleet arrived at the edge of the solar system on a Tuesday morning, and it looked like it had been through hell. 14 conclave warships, or what remained of them, hull breaches patched with emergency sealant, engine signatures stuttering and irregular, one vessel trailing debris so consistently it looked like a comet. They came in slow, broadcasting distress frequencies on 17 different bands, which told Mara everything. They weren't sure what frequencies Earth monitored, so they were trying all of them. Earth monitored all of them. The decision to respond took 6 hours of emergency consultation among world leaders. There were those who argued for silence, maintaining the illusion of a primitive world, preserving neutrality absolutely. There were those who argued this was exactly the moment humanity had been preparing for. Amara listened to both sides, asked 3 questions, and made the call. They responded. The voice that answered Earth's transmission was rough with exhaustion, and something that translated imperfectly as grief. Admiral Selvara of the Thalandry, a species that resembled, in human terms, something between a heron and a diplomat, had commanded the defense of Karath's Vale, a strategic conclave system that had held the Volkai advance for 3 years. The battle had lasted 9 days. She had gone in with 61 ships. 14 had come out. Earth offered food synthesized to Thalandry biological specifications, because Stillwater's biologists had been ready for this too. Medical assistance. Repair facilities at a discrete orbital platform officially designated as a decommissioned satellite hub. Selvara accepted with the stunned silence of someone who had asked a stranger for directions and been handed a home-cooked meal. "Why?" she asked during one of her early conversations with Amara. "You have no obligation, you have no stake in this war." "We have a stake in what kind of galaxy exists when the war is over," Amara said. Selvara was quiet for a long moment. "You are more than you appear," she said finally. "Most things are," Amara replied. The repairs took 3 weeks. In that time, Selvara's crew interacted with humans cautiously at first, then with increasing bewilderment. They had expected primitives. They found people who asked intelligent questions about Volkai tactical formations, who seemed unsurprised by alien biology, who treated the presence of 14 extraterrestrial warships in their solar system with the focused professionalism of people who had anticipated this moment. On the day of departure, Selvara requested a private channel with Amara. Her voice, when she spoke, had lost its diplomatic formality. "The Volkai received battle data from Karath's Vale," she said. "Standard post-engagement sweep. Their intelligence network is thorough." She paused. "There was an anomaly in the data. Long-range sensors registered your orbital platforms, your drive signatures from the vessels that assisted with repairs." Another pause, heavier this time. "They have flagged your world, Secretary General, neutral or not, Class 3 designation or not." The transmission crackled softly. "They are coming, I don't know when." But the Volkai do not ignore anomalies. After the channel closed, Amara sat alone in her office for exactly 4 minutes. Then she picked up the phone that connected her directly to the Stillwater command structure. "Tell everyone," she said, "the waiting is over." The Volkai Herald ship was beautiful, in the way that a surgeon's scalpel is beautiful, precise, purposeful, and designed entirely around function. It was larger than any vessel in Earth's orbit, matte black against the stars, its surface covered in geometric patterns that Stillwater's analysts had long since identified as a form of passive sensor array. It moved without hurry. It had no reason to hurry. It had done this before. 116 times before, according to Stillwater's records. 116 worlds had received the Herald. 116 civilizations had faced the same moment. Some had surrendered immediately. Some had fought and been destroyed. Not one had ever made the Volkai pause. The message came through on a broad-spectrum broadcast, self-translating. The Volkai were efficient even in their ultimatums. The voice had no emotion in it because there was no individual behind it. It was the hive speaking through a single throat. Designation, Sol 3. Classification revised to resource-capable. Your world contains materials required for Volkai expansion. Surrender of atmospheric processing rights, mineral extraction access, and available labor population is required. Compliance ensures species preservation in labor capacity. Resistance ensures species termination. You have 1 rotation of your planet to respond. 24 hours. In the war room beneath Geneva, Amara listened to the message played back 3 times. Around the table sat the heads of every major military, the directors of Stillwater's 7 divisions, and a handful of scientists who had spent their careers preparing for exactly this. The room was quiet, not the quiet of fear, the quiet of people who had rehearsed. General Tours of the United Earth Defense Command pulled up a tactical overlay on the central table. "Herald ship is consistent with all our models. Single vessel, diplomatic class, minimal armament. They don't need weapons on the Herald. The Herald is a formality." He looked around the table. "The fleet is already on its way. Standard Volkai doctrine, they dispatch the punishment fleet before the Herald even arrives. By the time we respond, they're already in transit." "How long until the fleet arrives?" Amara asked. "At standard Volkai transit speed, approximately 72 hours after our response." Amara nodded slowly. Then she looked at the communications officer. "Get me a channel to the Herald ship." The response she gave the Volkai was not what anyone in that room had fully expected, not even those who knew her well. She didn't refuse. She didn't declare war. She spoke with perfect calm in the tone of someone conducting a business negotiation. "We have received your terms," she said. "Before Earth responds formally, we require 72 hours to consult with our full planetary governance structure. We are a world of many nations. Decisions of this magnitude require consensus." A pause. "We mean no disrespect to your process. We simply ask for time." The Voakai hive mind processed this. It was unusual, but it was not defiance. And 72 hours was nothing, a rounding error in interstellar timescales. "Granted," the herald replied. 72 of your hours, then your answer." The channel closed. Tors looked at Amara. "Ma'am, that buys us exactly the window we needed." "I know," she said and stood up. "Let's not waste a second of it." World had never moved like this before. Not in any war, any crisis, any moment of collective urgency in recorded human history had so many people moved with such perfect, terrible coordination. Because unlike every crisis before it, this one had been planned for. Not hoped for. Not feared abstractly. Planned for with blueprints and timelines and contingency trees that went 17 branches deep. Within the first hour after Amara's response to the Herald, encrypted signals went out to 47 countries simultaneously. What followed looked, from orbit, like the world simply waking up. Orbital platforms that had spent years quietly disguised as weather monitoring arrays began low observable repositioning burns, spreading into a layered defensive grid that covered every approach vector to Earth. The platforms carried kinetic impactors, tungsten rods the size of telephone poles, accelerated to devastating velocities, guided by targeting systems that had been quietly improved for a decade using Voakai weapons data from salvaged battle debris. No explosives needed. Physics was enough. In shipyards in orbit that had never appeared on any public registry, vessels that looked like commercial cargo freighters began reconfiguration. Panels folded back to reveal weapon mounts. Drive systems switched from their cover profiles to configurations that Stillwater's engineers had spent years developing. Not quite conclave technology, not quite human technology, but a hybrid that was faster and more maneuverable than either. On the ground, in every major population center, people went about their lives. This was deliberate. Panic was a resource expenditure humanity couldn't afford. Those who needed to know knew. Everyone else would know soon enough. In the Nevada bunker, Mara Chen was running final analyses on something that had kept her awake for 3 years. The question of whether humanity's central tactical advantage would actually work. The Voakai were a hive mind. They thought collectively, coordinated perfectly, and adapted to patterns with terrifying speed. Against any conventional military, this made them nearly unbeatable. But a hive mind had a structural weakness that Mara had identified early and obsessed over ever since. It couldn't truly model individual decision-making. It could predict group behavior. It could anticipate doctrine. But humans, in the chaos of combat, didn't always follow doctrine. Sometimes a pilot made a decision that made no logical sense and worked. Sometimes a captain abandoned the plan entirely and improvised something that no tactical algorithm could have generated. The Voakai had never fought an enemy that fought like individuals. General Tors had built the entire combat doctrine around this insight. Human fighters were trained not to follow rigid formation patterns. They were trained to read the moment, trust their instincts, and make decisions that would look to a hive intelligence trying to model them like random noise. Against an enemy that won through perfect prediction, unpredictability was a weapon. Far out in the solar system, Selvara's fleet had not yet left. They'd been delayed, officially, by secondary repairs. Unofficially, because Selvara had watched the first 6 hours of Earth's preparation on her sensors and found herself unable to leave. She sat in her command chair, watching the data, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. She opened a private channel to her tactical officer. "Run the numbers again," she said quietly. "Earth's defensive configuration against the standard Voakai punishment fleet." The officer ran them, looked at the results, ran them again. "Admiral," he said slowly, "they might actually do this." Selvara watched a formation of Earth's reconfigured vessels slide into position with quiet precision. "Yes," she said, "I think they might." When the 72 hours expired, Amara returned to the communications channel. Her voice was the same as before, calm, unhurried, utterly composed. But something in it had shifted, in a way that perhaps only another leader who had ever sent people to war would recognize. "We have consulted our people," she said. A pause that lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Our answer is no." The Volkai punishment fleet dropped out of FTL at the edge of the solar system at 3:40 Greenwich Mean Time on a Thursday morning, and for approximately 11 seconds, nothing happened. Those 11 seconds were not inaction. They were assessment. 30 Volkai warships, each one larger than any vessel in Earth's arsenal, each one crewed by biomechanical units running off a single coordinated intelligence, spread into their standard assault formation and processed the sensor data from the space ahead of them. What they found did not match their models. The orbital grid alone was a problem. The Volkai's pre-arrival intelligence had flagged Earth's platforms, but had assessed them as primitive observation equipment. The targeting solutions now lighting up across 30 Volkai tactical displays were not consistent with primitive observation equipment. The hive mind processed this discrepancy in approximately 0.3 seconds and issued updated combat parameters across all 30 ships simultaneously. They had been misled. The planet was defended. This changed nothing about the outcome as far as the Volkai were concerned. 30 warships against a planetary defense grid of this scale was still a favorable engagement ratio. They had destroyed better defended worlds. They began their approach. The first kinetic impactors hit at 3:41. They came from the far side of the moon, a detail that was not accidental. Earth's military planners had positioned a kinetic battery on the lunar far side specifically because Volkai standard doctrine accounted for orbital defenses, but not for weapons firing from below the plane of engagement. The tungsten rods arrived at 0.4% the speed of light. 3 Volkai ships lost engine capacity in the first salvo. One lost hull integrity entirely and became debris. 29 ships. The electromagnetic disruption fields came next. Tuned, and this was the part that made Volkai tactical systems generate their first-ever anomalous processing flag, tuned specifically to Volkai shield harmonics. Not close, not approximate, exact. The shields of 7 ships flickered and dropped for 4.2 seconds. In those 4.2 seconds, Earth's reconfigured freighter fighters were already moving. They didn't move in formation. That was the thing that the Volkai tactical AI spent the most processing power on, in the seconds that followed, trying to find the pattern in the human attack vectors, because everything had a pattern, every species had a doctrine, and doctrine was predictable. But the human pilots weren't running a doctrine. They were running on instinct, adrenaline, years of training that had specifically told them, when it matters, trust yourself more than the plan. A fighter pilot named Yusuf Ibarra, 26 years old, from Lagos, made a decision at 3:43 that no tactical algorithm would ever have generated. He flew his vessel directly through the debris field of the destroyed Volkai ship, using the expanding cloud of wreckage as cover, and came out the other side 30 meters from a Volkai cruiser's unshielded engine manifold. He fired once. The cruiser detonated. The explosion took out 2 adjacent ships. 3 ships destroyed, 2 damaged, in 11 seconds of improvisation. The hive mind was still trying to model him, when he did it again somewhere else entirely. 19 ships were destroyed in 40 minutes. The remaining 11 disengaged, broke formation, burned hard for the FTL threshold, and jumped. In 11 years of war, no Volkai fleet had ever retreated. Retreat was not a concept the hive mind had needed before. In the war rooms of the Galactic Conclave, distributed across a dozen star systems, commanders received the battle data feed simultaneously. Many of them watched it twice. Some watched it 3 times, stopping the playback at moments that didn't seem physically possible. A Thailandry senator, watching the footage of 11 Volkai ships fleeing a single planet's defense, set down the data pad very carefully and said to the empty room, "What have we been leaving alone all this time?" The battle data reached every corner of the conclave within 48 hours, and it hit the galactic political landscape like a stone through still water. The ripples were immediate and complicated. Among conclave military commands, the reaction was a mixture of awe and a particular kind of embarrassed awe, the feeling of someone who had walked past the same door 100 times, and only now noticed it had been open the whole time. Intelligence analysts who had maintained Earth's Class 3 primitive designation scrambled to explain how their assessments had been so comprehensively wrong. The answer, which took them several days to fully accept, was straightforward and humbling. Humanity had been deliberately hiding, not through deception exactly, but through performance. They had played the role assigned to them perfectly, because it suited them to do so. For the Vorkai, the reaction was something different, something unprecedented. The hive mind did not experience shock in the way individuals do, but it experienced the functional equivalent, a recalibration cascade, a systemic revision of models and projections. Earth was reclassified internally from resource target to active threat. This was not a status the Vorkai had assigned to many civilizations. It meant something. Selvara came to Earth 2 weeks after the battle. She came not as a refugee this time, but as an official representative of the Thaylandry, the most influential species in the Conclave, and the one most responsible for Earth's original classification. She arrived with a delegation of 20, descended to Geneva in a shuttle that Earth's air traffic systems tracked with quiet precision, and was met on the ground by Amara herself. The meeting was, by diplomatic standards, extraordinarily direct. "The Conclave wants an alliance," Selvara said once the formalities were done. "Formally, a military alliance, full integration of Earth's defense forces into the Conclave structure." "Full integration," Amara repeated, "under Conclave command structure." "Yes. No." Selvara's crest, the feather-like array of sensory structures along her neck that Thaylandry used to convey emotion, shifted into a configuration that Stillwater's xenopsychologists had catalogued as surprise-edged with respect. "You're negotiating." "We're always negotiating," Amara said. "What we want is a seat at the command table, not a chair in the back of the room, a seat at the table where strategy is decided. Full intelligence sharing. Complete technology exchange, everything, not the filtered version the Conclave shares with junior allies. Sovereignty guarantees, and the right to conduct independent military operations within the broader Allied strategy." There were Conclave representatives in that room who found those terms offensive. One said so, loudly. A Draven council member whose species had been in the Conclave for 300 years, and found the idea of terms from a world that had been relevant for 3 weeks to be beyond impudent. Selvara played the battle footage again. Specifically, she played the segment showing 11 Vorkai ships breaking and running. The Draven council member stopped talking. The alliance was signed 4 days later. The terms were exactly as Amara had stated. Not close, exactly. Back in the Nevada bunker, Mara Chen watched the signing ceremony on a monitor and allowed herself, briefly, to smile. Then she went back to her console, because the Vorkai had never accepted defeat, and the next wave of data from their fleet movements was already coming in. It was larger, much larger. The proposal landed in front of the Conclave Joint Command like something thrown through a window, unexpected, alarming, and impossible to ignore. Earth wanted to attack. Not defend, not hold a line, not respond to the next Vorkai incursion. Strike first, strike deep, and hit a target that the Conclave had considered strategically significant for years, but had never had the tactical creativity to hit effectively. Vorkai Logistics Hub Keth 9, a massive orbital installation in a System 3 jump points from the front line. Keth 9 processed resource shipments from 60 Vorkai-occupied worlds, and supplied the fuel, materials, and biological processing units for roughly a third of the active Vorkai war fleet. It was, in practical terms, the stomach of the beast. The Conclave had tried to hit it twice before. Both attempts had ended in catastrophic fleet losses. The installation was fortified with overlapping defense layers, positioned in a system with 3 natural FTL interdiction zones, and protected by a permanent garrison fleet of 40 warships. Every approach vector the Conclave's tactical models generated ended in acceptable losses for the Vorkai and unacceptable losses for the Conclave. Earth's plan didn't use any of those approach vectors. General Torres presented it to the Joint Command personally, walking senior Conclave officers through a proposal so layered with misdirection that several of them had to stop him repeatedly to ask if he was being serious. He was. The plan used a decoy fleet to trigger Vorkai defensive protocols and pull the garrison out of position. Then a second force, human-crewed, fast, and running on the hybrid drive system Stillwater had been developing for years, would hit the installation from an angle the Vorkai's own FTL interdiction zones made look physically impossible. They weren't. They were just very difficult, and required a level of precise navigation that only worked if the pilots were willing to trust improvised corrections in real time. Human pilots were very good at trusting improvised corrections in real time. One Conclave admiral said, reviewing the plan, This relies on your pilots making 17 independent decisions correctly under combat stress. Yes, Torres said. That's not a plan, that's a hope. With respect, Admiral, Torres said, that's the difference between us. The joint fleet launched 3 weeks later. The Conclave vessels executed the decoy operation by the numbers, precise, disciplined, exactly as planned. The Volkai garrison responded exactly as Earth's models predicted, pulling toward the apparent threat. Then the human vessels hit the gap. What followed was 31 minutes of combat that Conclave historians would later spend years writing about. The human pilots did not fly the mission as planned. They flew it as felt, adapting every 10 seconds to changing conditions, finding angles and moments that no tactical AI would have generated because no tactical AI thought the way they thought. Commander Priya Kapoor, leading the strike wing, made a decision 4 minutes in to abandon the primary attack corridor entirely and fly her 12 ships through the installation's own communication array, using its interference pattern as cover for the final approach run. It shouldn't have worked. It worked. Keth 9 burned for 6 hours. The garrison fleet, out of position and trying to respond to an attack vector that its models couldn't fully process, lost 11 ships in the chaos. The decoy fleet, watching from a safe distance, reported that the Volkai formation behavior, normally a model of synchronized perfection, was fragmented, hesitant, full of processing delays that each lasted only fractions of a second, but added up over 31 minutes to something that looked almost like confusion. The hive mind had never been confused before. As the Allied fleet regrouped and began its withdrawal, Selvara appeared on the command channel. She had been aboard the Conclave flagship for the operation. Her voice was different than it had ever been in her conversations with Amara. Quieter, more careful. "Your admiral," she said. "Ask her how they planned for so many contingencies." The message was relayed. The human admiral, Commander Kapoor, tired and still running on adrenaline, gave an answer that got passed around Conclave command networks for weeks afterward. "We didn't plan for them," she said. "We planned to handle whatever came." They came with 300 ships. It was the largest single fleet the Volkai had assembled since the opening year of the war. Every other front went quiet as resources were redirected, garrison fleets were stripped down, long-term expansion operations were paused. The hive mind had made a calculation, and the calculation was this: Earth was the variable that had broken the war's momentum. Earth was the infection point in the Conclave's collapse. Remove Earth and the Conclave's new resolve would evaporate. The math was simple. They had never been wrong about math before. The Allied fleet met them at the heliopause, the boundary where the sun's solar wind gives way to interstellar space, a vast and empty battlefield that humanity had chosen deliberately. Not because it was the easiest place to fight, because it was the place where every tactical option was available, where nothing was fixed, where improvisation had the most room to breathe. The Conclave contributed 240 warships. Earth contributed 60. On paper, it was an absurd ratio, 60 human vessels among 300 Conclave and Volkai ships. But within the first 10 minutes of engagement, every Conclave commander in the fleet understood what they were really there for: to hold the lines, hold the flanks, anchor the engagement. The humans were there to break things. The battle lasted 4 hours and 22 minutes. There are no simple words for what happened during those 4 hours. Official records run to thousands of pages. Historians have spent decades parsing individual decisions made in individual seconds that changed the outcome of specific engagements, that changed the shape of the wider battle. But there are moments that appear in every account. The moment when Torres ordered the 3rd Human Strike Wing to feign retreat, pulling 6 Volkai destroyers out of formation in pursuit, then revering hard and destroying all 6 in a coordinated crossfire that the destroyers flew directly into, because the hive mind had already committed to the pursuit and could not issue a reversal order faster than physics moved. The moment when Yusuf Ibarra, now a wing commander, led his ships into the middle of the Volkai fleet's center mass, deliberately accepting fire, drawing the attention of 40 ships inward while Conclave vessels hit the flanks unopposed. He lost 2 ships. The flanking maneuver cost the Volkai 30. The moment 90 minutes in when the Volkai fleet's formation cohesion, its greatest strength, the thing that had made it invincible for a century, began to show irregular gaps. Not from losses, from processing latency. The hive mind was running too many simultaneous models, adapting and readapting to human behavior patterns it couldn't predict, and the weight of that uncertainty was measurably slowing its response time. Milliseconds. But milliseconds in a battle are everything. The hive mind noticed its own degradation. It recognized for the first time in its existence that it was losing, not later, not eventually, but now in real time, and that the trajectory was not recoverable. It ran the projections. It ran them again. And then something happened in the Volkai fleet that not even Earth's most optimistic pre-battle models had predicted. They stopped. Not a tactical repositioning, not a feint. The fleet stopped collectively for 2.3 seconds, 2 full seconds where 300 ships did nothing, as if the intelligence driving them had paused to think, and in those 2.3 seconds the Allied fleet hit them with everything they had. When the Volkai fleet finally broke and ran, 61 ships remained. They jumped to FTL in ragged sequence, not the synchronized withdrawal of a disciplined force, but the flight of something that had felt, for the first time, what it was to face an opponent it could not solve. The Allied fleet didn't pursue. There was no need. In the silence that followed, Selvara sat in her command chair and looked at her sensor readouts for a long time. Her communications officer told her Amara was on the line. She took the channel. "It's done," Amara said. "Yes," Selvara said. "How are you feeling?" A pause outside Amara's window. Somewhere on Earth the sun was rising. "Tired," she said honestly, "and already thinking about what we missed, what we could do better." Selvara made a sound that Stillwater's translators rendered as a gentle laugh. "Of course you are." 3 months later, the Volkai entered formal disengagement proceedings, not a peace treaty, because the hive mind did not think in terms of peace. It simply redirected its expansion vectors away from all territories near Earth's influence. The math had finally produced an answer the hive mind could not argue with. In this direction, there was an enemy it could not predict, could not model, and could not outlast. The conclave held celebrations on 12 worlds. They gave speeches about unity and perseverance and the courage of allied species. They gave Amara a medal. She accepted it graciously. That same week, deep beneath the Nevada desert, Mara Chen started a new file. She labeled it Project Stillwater II, and on the first page she wrote a single question. If not the Volkai, then who comes next? Because that was the thing about humanity, the thing that every species in the galaxy was only beginning to understand. They didn't celebrate and stand down. They didn't declare victory and stop watching the dark. They filed the lessons, identified the gaps, and prepared for the next threat before the echoes of the last one had faded. The Volkai had knocked on the wrong door. The conclave had always known it was surviving. The enemy had always known it was winning. Only humanity had known, quietly and patiently, exactly what it was doing. Waiting, preparing, watching.